Velkommen til University Aula. Welcome to the University Aula. Ved evakueringen av hoveddøren bak og sidedøren i salen. Alle skal gå rolig ned og ut til samlingsplassen foran museet ved statuen. In case of an emergency, evacuation exits are in the back and by the farther side of the room. Everyone has to walk out calmly and gather in front of the museum by the Christie statue. Thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon, laureate, seminar speakers, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this Nils Klim Seminar in honor of the 2023 Nils Klim laureate, Simona Zetterberg Nielsen, from Aarhus University, Denmark. My name is Kjersti Frøttum. I'm the chair of the Holberg board, who annually awards the Nils Klim Prize to outstanding young scholars from the Nordic countries in the humanities, social sciences, law, and theology. We welcome you that are present here in the University Aula, as well as all of you that follow the event on the live stream from around the world. Now, for the Nils Klim Seminar, the laureate is asked to propose a topic, as well as the persons with whom she would like to converse. And we look now very much forward to taking part in the presentations and discussions during this year's Nils Klim Seminar in honor of Simona Zetterberg Nielsen, who, for her seminar, has chosen the very interesting and relevant title of her topic, very relevant also for today's society, Enlightenment Perspectives on Fact and Fiction. And to present the laureate and the seminar speakers, I will give the floor to Jørgen Magnus Sejersted, Professor of Nordic Literature at the University of Bergen, who will be moderating the event. So please, Jørgen.
Thank you, Kjersti. As you just heard, this year's recipient of the Nils Klim Award, which is awarded to an outstanding young scholar from or in the Nordic countries, is, as you now know, Simona Zetterberg Nielsen. She is Associate Professor at the School of Communication and Culture within Scandinavian Studies at Aarhus University, Denmark. And Aarhus University is where Zetterberg Nielsen has built her academic career, with spells as a visiting student and visiting scholar at academic institutions in Europe, Australia, and the USA. Her PhD dissertation from 2016 has the title Fictionality and the Formation of the Novel, with a focus on the invention of 18th century Danish fiction. The dissertation was awarded the PhD prize from Aarhus University Research Foundation. Since 2016, Zetterberg Nielsen has published extensively on the topics of the theory of fictionality and the history of the novel. And she has played an active part in the international scholarly debate on these issues. She has also called attention to the Danish novels of the 18th century and demonstrated how these, largely forgotten works, scarcely read or analyzed in at least 200 years, many of them, are indeed interesting examples of how the crystallization of the rhetoric of fictionality develops in the 18th century. Thus, Zetterberg Nielsen combines in-depth literary historical investigation with state-of-the-art theoretical debate in a very successful way, and makes a substantial and lasting contribution to Danish, and then by extension also Norwegian, but also Nordic and European literary history. Her latest book, which is recently submitted for evaluation as Dr. Philos, is a 500-page monograph in Danish representing and discussing the earliest Danish novels within the model of the genesis of fictionality. Alongside her many research publications, Zetterberg Nielsen publishes vivid and accessible popular introduction to fictionality, and she applies her research to phenomena of fictionality and fact in modern culture in a compelling and enlightening way. So her dissemination record is impressive and completes this unity of theory, history, and modern culture, which is represented in her work. Zetterberg Nielsen is still developing her area of research, as she has recently received a grant to establish a research group on fictionality and science. We are looking very much forward to your contribution in the years to come, but today we are celebrating what you have already achieved, Simone. So congratulations with this highly deserved award. I now call for the participants of the panel to take their seats at the stage. Now, for this seminar, first, Zetterberg Nielsen will give an introduction to the topic, which, as Kjersti said, is Enlightenment perspective on fact and fiction. Then we will get 20 minutes presentations from the 3 invited guests and colleagues of Simona. And they will be presented in turn, but I will just briefly mention their names, since you can all see them here. They are Samuli Bjørninen of Tampere University of Finland, Aina Nøding of the National Library of Oslo, Norway, and Ulrik Langen from the University of Copenhagen. Welcome to everybody. After their presentations, there will be a panel discussion and room for Q&A. And then by 1500, 3 o'clock, we shall be finished. So, Simona, I give the floor to you.
Thank you so much for your kind introductions. It's really a great honor to be here and see so many happy faces. Dear colleagues, friends, families, member of the audience, welcome to this year's Nils Klim Seminar, Enlightenment Perspectives on Fact and Fiction. Let me begin by thanking for the opportunity to compose the Nils Klim Seminar in the wonderful surroundings of Ludwig Holberg's birthplace. In fact, in the very novel which gave name to the Nils Klim Prize, Holberg placed Bergen on top of the world. In the novel Nils Klim, the main character travels to the mountain Fløyen to conduct a scientific investigation of a mountain cave. A location that is so precisely described in the novel that we can even go and visit what could have been the cave of Nils Klim today. Some of the descriptions of the geographical locations and the world map of Nils Klim bears resemblance to what we would find in books of natural history of the 18th century. However, in the books of natural history, the sun is placed beside the Earth and not inside of it, as on Ludwig Holberg's Earth map. Holberg's illustration of the world gives a whole new meaning to the discussion of the heliocentric universe. Not only is the sun the center of the solar system, in Nils Klim it is the center of the Earth. Holberg's fictional Earth map might be interpreted as the first of many parodies and humorous reflections on scientific debates in Nils Klim. Holberg was both an Enlightenment thinker, a natural philosopher, the scientists of those days, and a writer of fiction. In fact, in the 18th century, the distinctions between different academic disciplines and sciences, between fact and fiction, were only in the making. Today, when we enter a bookshop, a library, or our account on Netflix, we are greeted by signs that direct us towards either fictional or factual genres. But in Holberg's days, these generic designators and demarcations were only in the making. The new boundary between fact and fiction that appeared in the 18th century is the subject of this seminar. The central question which will unite our talks today is: how was the fact-fiction distinction established? I am truly honored that my colleagues Samuel Bjørninen, Einar Nøding, and Ulrik Langen have all accepted the invitation to consider this question with me today. Together, we will explore the matter by studying various genres from different angles and disciplines. My own contribution to the discussion centers on the novel as a rising genre of the 18th century. The argument I'm proposing is that the novel was a cornerstone in establishing the fact-fiction distinction that we today rely on, as it was the first recognizable genre of fiction arising in 18th century Denmark-Norway. My assertion that the novel becomes the first recognizable genre of fiction builds on a threefold argument. First, 18th century novels spent bottles of expensive printing ink in their prefaces, explaining what the emergent genre of fiction entailed. Fiction was something that needed to be explained. Second, the novel was the first genre which deliberately distinguished itself from neighboring genres as travel literature, history writing, and conduct books by means of its fictionality. Third and last, I'll offer some preliminary explanations as to why the novel rises as a fictional genre in the 18th century. I'll come to argue that the precondition for fiction as a genre was a scientific discourse of factuality. In the following, I will expand each of these arguments. We have a desire to know whether a series, a film, or a book is fictional or factual. And sometimes our desire is met by disclaimers in the beginning of a series or a novel that may be more or less helpful. But we would be truly surprised if a series or a novel introduced itself explaining to us what fiction is. It is taken for granted that we as readers or audiences know what it means that something is fiction. However, in the 18th century, almost all novels would hold a preface, an introductory text, which explained to the reader what a novel and fiction was. The first novel written in Denmark-Norway is the very novel which we celebrate in this seminar today, namely Ludvig Holberg's Nils Klim. The essence of the novel is that Nils Klim travels through a hole in Mountain Fløyen, which I believe is right behind us, here in Bergen, and he discovers that inside the Earth there is another planet inhabited by human-like trees who are much more sophisticated than the humans on the outside of the Earth. Nils Klim contains a lengthy preface in which Holberg satirizes attempts to believe that an invented story is true. As an ironic remark, he provides us with 3 good reasons for why we should believe that Nils Klim has traveled to the underworld. The first good reason why we should believe in the story is that Nils Klim's children and grandchildren who were born after his underground travels testify as eyewitnesses. The second is a handwritten document. And in the very unlikely event that the reader should not believe the story by now, the final proof is that a Laplander has transformed himself into an eagle, flown into the tunnels that Nils Klim used when he discovered the underworld, and has subsequently confirmed the existence of the tunnel. The function of the joke is not just to make the reader laugh at something silly. Holberg's preface serves as a parody on travel accounts of his days that pretended to be true even if they told fantastic and unreliable stories. It is a parody in the true sense of the word, as it mimics a familiar style and simultaneously undermines the seriousness thereof. Holberg wrote Nils Klim on the backdrop of stories that were not trustworthy, and he participated in establishing a fictional genre that could be trusted in the sense that it did not try to hide its inventions. The second Danish novel ever written is Erik Pontoppiddan's Minosa, an Asian prince who traveled the world. In the preface to the novel, Pontoppiddan comments on what it means that a novel is fictional. He declares, "One of the oldest ways to learning is to imagine the truth, not only in clear, dry, and bare rules, but also for the sake of the essence of the human. The exemplary parables, fables, fictions, which both become visible the soonest and is stored in the memory the longest. Therefore, we find that our great master, the wise Jesus, has chosen exactly the same emblematic ways of teaching and populated parts of his speeches with fables of the instructive and devotional kind. So here, Pontoppidan uses Jesus as an excuse for writing fiction. If the great authority Jesus was using fictionality in the form of parables and fables, Pontoppidan can allow himself to do so as well. He also makes sure to explain to the reader the advantages of fiction over fact. We grasp fictional stories easier than dry facts, and what is more, they are stored in our memory much longer. The preface to Minosa tells us, first, that Pontoppidan needed to explain to the reader what fiction was, and second, that the rhetorical devices of parables and fables were the only available objects of comparisons since there were no previous genre of fiction. Holberg and Pontoppidan initiated the preface novel in Denmark, Norway, and the many novelists who followed continued to include explanatory prefaces in their works, explaining to the reader what a novel and fiction is. These tell us that the authors could not take a reader for granted who knew what fiction was. And what is more, the authors themselves were just finding out what it meant to write in a genre that did not claim to be true. My next observation as to the earliest Danish novel is that the novel was the first genre which deliberately distinguished itself from neighboring genres by means of its fictionality. In my studies, I have discovered that in 18th century Denmark-Norway, we find 3 succeeding subgenres of novels. Castaway travel novels from around 1740 to 1760, historical novels from 1760 to 1780, and conduct novels in the period 1780 to 1800. I'll move on to demonstrate how each of these subgenres differentiate themselves from neighboring genres by means of the fictionality. The Castaway travel novel, because they feature clearly invented stories in which everything is possible. The historical novels, because they include psychological and causal explanations that we do not find in history writing. And the conduct novels, because they follow a fictional logic in which the well-raised always ends up happy, while the one with a bad upbringing gets what he or she, in the name of the poetic justice, deserves. Travel narratives were hugely popular in the 18th century, and for a long period of time, all the novels published in Denmark featured travels. Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe from 1719 had a major impact on the earlier Scandinavian novels. In fact, in the first part of the 18th century, all novels had to include a shipwreck. Sometimes you'll find that a given novelist seems to have forgotten about the shipwreck, and then, as a last note, he or she adds, and then the main character went out on a ship and stranded on a deserted island. What sets the fictional travel narrative apart from the factual is, amongst other things, that everything is possible in the Castaway novels. Supernatural creatures like the tree people from Holberg's Nils Klim, women who become cosmopolitans by traveling the world, a male homosexual couple who raises a child together, and a critique of imperialism. It seems that fictional stories that take place abroad grants themselves a freedom that no other genre does, following the dictum, as long as it doesn't happen at home, everything is allowed. I'll bring forth only one of the many travel novels in order to illustrate the freedom granted by fiction, namely Carl August Thiele's The Sailor, who becomes emperor in Moataba and then again a sailor, from 1759. The novel is extraordinary because it is written in the heydays of the Castaway novel, but features a critique of the European traveler who thinks he owns whatever land he lands on. In his study of the Castaway narrative in England, Rebecca Weaver Hightower argues that the Castaway narrative is founded on the idea that the colonist has the right to conquer whatever land meets his eye. Thiele's novel, The Sailor, repeats the common plot of the castaway story with one important exception. Thielu lets the reader know that the main character, Michel Floridan, is evil. As such, we find in the novel the first portrait in the history of the Danish novel of a malicious main character. Michel exploits everything he meets on the island. I had, he admits, during the last 2 or 3 years, undergone a change and now found the greatest pleasure in deceiving women and committing murder. In the end, Michel is overturned by the other Europeans on the island and is arrested, but he manages to escape. As such, the novel displays the corrupted white European who has no respect for other cultures and whose only motivation for traveling is his greed. Thielu's novel is unique not only in Scandinavia but in a European perspective, since it warns the reader against the exploitation of nature and of other cultures at a time where travel accounts at large were celebrated in Europe. A travel narrative as Thielu's was only possible, I contend, because it was fictional and therefore did not critique any particular person or nation as such. The rise of fiction opened the possibilities for critique that is still relevant today. The castaway travel novels were immensely popular in the first part of the 18th century, but around 1760, the genre declined as the historical novel took over. Peter Frederik Suhm, who lived from 1728 to 1798, has been called the first modern Danish historian, and he was, at the same time, the first writer of historical fiction in Denmark. Suhm based his history books and his novels on the same stories, which he took from the sagas and from Saxo Grammaticus Gesta Danorum. By studying the difference between his enterprise as a historian and as a novelist, we get a unique insight into how fiction was created in contrast to the factual genre of history. As a historian, Suhm did his best to conduct source criticism and be true to the historical accounts that lay the foundation of his work, but in his fictional novels, he deliberately rewrote history, adding character psychology, causal explanations, a writing style that imitated the sagas, and his own ideology of the Old Norse people as a model for his contemporaries. On his ideological agenda was a renewal of gender roles. Suhm used the fictional form of the novel to reverse the gender roles as they appear in Saxo and the sagas, so that the women become strong and enterprising while the men are emotional. In the sagas, nothing is more dangerous than questioning masculinity. In Njal's saga, for example, the main protagonist, Gunnar, is accused of having cried when he is wounded in the cheek by a rider's track. As revenge for this accusation, Gunnar and his brother kill 8 men. Suhm's novel Signe and Harbor is a perfect contrast to the kind of masculinity we find in the sagas. The hero Harbor bursts into tears no less than 5 times during the novel, and his beloved Signe defends him by saying, "True heroes are tender." Suhm's dual enterprise as a historian and a novelist demonstrates how history writing and the novel became 2 different genres in the 18th century, and that the fictional form had its advantages. Once Suhm could rely on a reader who understood that his writings were fictional, he could allow himself the freedom to add invented psychological motivations to the historical people, causal connections to the historical events, and to promote his own ideology. From the last 2 decades of the 18th century, we encounter novels with titles such as The God-Fearing and Happy Farmer, The Strange and Curious Incidents of Cecilia and the Wicked Daughter, Her Flaws, Her Bad Behavior Towards Her Husband, and the Subsequent Punishment, David Honest, and Jørn, The Life Story of a Fool. You do not need to read the novels to know the moral of the stories. The last dominating genre of Danish novels in the 18th century is the conduct novel. Conduct books that told young men, and especially women, how to behave was a flourishing genre of the 18th century. However, the conduct novel was an even more efficient teaching tool, and it was so because of its fictionality. The novel, in contrast to the conduct book, offers a lengthy story driven by cause and effect, which displays how a well-conducted upbringing and education leads to a prosperous life. The leading author of 18th century Danish conduct novels was Charlotte Dorthea Biel. She was a radical thinker when it came to promoting education of women. While the most popular educational thinker of the 18th century, Rousseau, believed that women should be educated only with the purpose of pleasing men, Biel declared that the purpose of her writings was to change the education that women received. And there was one parameter in particular she wanted to make subject to change. Namely, that women were taught to focus on the outer rather than the inner virtues, to dress well instead of reasoning well. In her novels, Biel promotes the message that the gender roles are not biological, but comes about because of a difference in educational practices, an argument which Ludwig Holberg had also proposed. One of the novels in which Biel most clearly develops her ideas of women's education is Emilie or Perseverance Rewarded, the title being a comment on Rousseau's educational book, Emile. In Biel's novel, Emilia's brother goes to university, while Emilia stays at home with her mother, who only teaches her about appearances. Biel writes, "The origin of all her delusions lay in a wrong upbringing. For as much attention as one had given to the external, as little had come into consideration concerning the internal. Luckily, Emilia's faith is saved by a tutor who takes over her upbringing, and she ends up knowledgeable and happy." Biel and contemporary novelists like Emanuel Balling and Knud Lyne Rahbek use the fictional form of the novel to play out morals that are too clear-cut to happen in real life, but which work well in conduct fiction. As such, by the end of the 18th century, the novel has also become a perfect teaching tool. I began this talk with the humorous example of the preface to Nils Klim, which makes fun of books that pretend to be something they are not. And I now wish to conclude by returning to Holberg's one and only novel. Nils Klim is a parody on travel writings that pretended to be true, even if they include fantastic events, and on novels that do not admit that they are fictions. In the beginning of the 18th century, it was common practice to pretend that a novel was a true story. The most famous example in world literature is Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, which declares that it is written by himself and that it is by Robinson Crusoe himself. The history of the novel began with works that pretended to be true, but during the course of the 18th century, the novel gave up its declarations on truth, while the novel label gained its meaning, the meaning which we today take for granted as I am fiction. The argument I pursued is that the story of the rise of the novel is the story of the rise of fiction. Not just in a trivial sense where novel equates fiction, but in the sense that the story of the novel tells us how the first genre of fiction was born. I've outlined the contours of how the 18th century novel in Denmark, Norway slowly claimed its fictional form. In its direct communication to the reader through its prefaces, by differentiating itself from neighboring genres, and by means of the novel label which came to signal fictionality. However, one question remains. If the novel, as I've argued, rises as a fictional genre in the 18th century, why did it wait so long? This is the question I'm seeking answers to in a new project called The Science of Fiction, which I will initiate once I return from Bergen. But essentially, I believe that some of the answers are buried in Nils Klim. Nils Klim begins with the map with the solar system within the Earth and ends with Nils Klim's friend and fellow academic Abelin, to whom Nils Klim tells the story of his underground travels. Abelin denies the truthfulness of Klim's story, but Klim insists that several great philosophers have assumed the Earth to be hollow and that there is another smaller planet within it. The novel is through and through a rejection of superstition and an engagement with scientific debates. Not long after Holberg's novel, scientists actually proposed that the Earth might be hollow and potentially could contain other life forms, and even today it's possible to find advocates of that theory. Holberg's discussion was spot on, and I've discovered that many of the earliest novels take science as a main theme. My hypothesis, then, is that the reason why the first writers of fiction were preoccupied with science is that the scientific revolution leading up to the 18th century brought with it a notion of fact that was the precondition for fiction. Thus, I reason that the division of fictional and factual genres, which we today rely on, only came about in the 18th century on the backdrop of an empirical discourse of factuality established during the scientific revolution. These are the preliminary answers I'm proposing in my new project, which I will embark on in the near future. And I'm very happy to have family Bergen on board on those ventures. In our project, we will explore 18th century periodicals, teaching materials, novels, and scientific writings to further investigate the relationship between fact, fiction, and science. As such, the journey of Nils Klim is still ongoing. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Simona, for a wonderful presentation of the negotiation of fact and fiction in some of the novels. And yet these are only a few examples of the fascinating novels that you highlight in your research. Now we turn to the next speaker. He has already been mentioned, Samuli Björninen. He is a researcher at Tampere University of Finland. His PhD from 2018 at Tampere has the title Poetics at the Interface, Patterns of Thought and Protocols of Reading in Studies of Thomas Pynchon's V. Björninen has published on narrative theory, theory of reading, and the rhetorical use of factuality in narrative, the false dichotomy of facts versus narrative, and the conceptual underpinnings of narrative terminology. He has held a postdoctoral fellowship at the Center of Fictionality Studies at Aarhus University, to which he will be returning, as we heard, in the autumn. The title of his paper today is Factuality and the Rise of Modern Narrative Genres. Samuli, welcome to Bergen. The floor is yours.
Thanks for the introduction. It's such a pleasure and privilege to be here as part of this Nils Klim Seminar, which hardly couldn't have gotten a better start than Simona's talk. As the description of today's panel says, today we perhaps take the division between fact and fiction for granted. We can imagine this being said with a sense of relief, as in, at least we can still count on there being a distinction. But we can also imagine this being said in a cautionary way. Perhaps we shouldn't have taken it for granted for so long. Indeed, one of the diagnostics about the so-called post-truth era is that the seemingly stable epistemological categories, such as fact, fiction, and falsehood, are faltering. The diligent work of the Nils Klim laureate Simona Zetterberg-Nielsen on the early novel stands in opposition to the simplistic and totalizing tendencies of post-truth discourses, because it shows that there is no justification for treating fiction and fictionality as transhistorical and immutable in the first place. In the light of Simona's work and the work of other scholars focusing on how the Enlightenment produced the modern genres, we can begin to understand how the distinction of fact and fiction became so strong and intuitive that it can be, or at least for a long time it could be, taken for granted. My talk approaches narrative genres of the Enlightenment in a similar vein, but with focus on factuality. I will look into how conceptions of factuality arising in Enlightenment-era science, economics, and politics inform narrative genres that developed during the same period. I will show how these ideas have been linked to the rise of genres that, like the novel, began to find their modern form and function in the Enlightenment era. There are two key ideas I want to talk about. The idea of the modern fact as introduced by cultural historian and literary scholar Mary Povey, and the distinction of rational and factual truths as found in Hannah Arendt's political thought. These conceptions of factuality are inextricably linked to the 18th century Enlightenment ideas, while also being not only intelligible from our point of view, but quite evident and operational in contemporary debates about fact, fiction, and falsehood. The modern fact is described by Mary Povey as a component of knowledge production that emerges due to two developments: the separation of observed particulars from theories and the elevation of particulars to the status of evidence that is capable of proving or disproving theories. The modern fact that emerges from these preconditions is an epistemological unit that presents apparently value-free descriptive data that apparently stand outside or prior to interpretation. As Povey shows, the rise of the modern fact starts actually in the 17th century. However, it is the Enlightenment era instrument of knowledge production, such as periodicals, newspapers, and pamphlets, that help disseminate this notion of factuality throughout the institutions and audiences of the market society. The idea that proper factuality resides in its own objective and value-free realm is also bolstered by the popularity of mathematical and logical puzzles, which art historian Barbara Maria Stafford, in her fascinating book Artful Science, names rational recreations. What emerges from this cultural system is a conception of factuality that is very much recognizable to us today. The modern fact is epitomized by particulars that can be represented numerically, and even though there is no necessary connection between the modern fact and numerical representation, numerical facts are indeed the epitome. In addition to the modern fact, I want to bring up the distinction found in philosopher Hannah Arendt's writings on politics. In her essay Truth and Politics, Arendt argues that since Leibniz, we have distinguished rational truths from factual truths. Rational truths would include the most typical examples of what Povey calls the modern fact, as they include mathematical, scientific, and philosophical truths. Factual truths, on the other hand, are always related to other people, and they concern events and circumstances that involve many. They are the contingent things that are the way they are, not by necessity, but because they happen to be that way. Therefore, according to Arendt, factual truths gain legitimacy by the power of witnessing and testimony. And indeed, historical facts are an exemplary case of factual truth. While factual truths are also subject to error and illusion, we can of course be mistaken about historical facts, for instance, they are more importantly uniquely susceptible to deliberate falsehoods and lying. I want to argue that these ideas are pertinent to the topic of this seminar for two reasons. Firstly, they emerge in the early Enlightenment era as part of the epistemological and social reorganization of categories of knowledge, and in relation to the modern narrative genres that take shape during the same period. Secondly, they are still recognizable to us. Even though they emerged in the Enlightenment, these conceptions of factuality still inform current debates. They are echoed, often in a distorted form, in the heated exchanges of the so-called science and culture wars, and in the polarized political debates taking place in the post-truth climate. Today, it is widely acknowledged that the novel is part of the cultural apparatuses that helped establish the categories of knowledge in the Enlightenment era. While the novel as a genre became prominently a site for fictionality, it also circulated the Enlightenment ideas of factuality, such as the modern fact. Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe is a prime example, and one often mentioned. As anyone familiar with the book will remember, Crusoe displays exemplary rationalism throughout his various adventures. Calculating his resources fastidiously is key to his survival. But this is not the only way in which Crusoe shows his understanding of the knowledge-producing tools of his time. While deserted on the island, he also takes stock of his fortunes and misfortunes, and in doing so, he thinks, by his own admission, like a homo economicus of his age. Crusoe says, I quote, "And I state it very impartially, like a debtor and creditor, the comforts I enjoyed against the miseries I suffered thus." End quote. After this, we see side by side, as if in a double entry ledger, an account of the pros and cons, or as he implies, the debit and credit of his situation. The modern fact permeates Robinson Crusoe and the early novel more generally, but the curious way in which it does so gains elucidation from the work of rhetorical fictionality theorists, and in particular Simona's work. In the rhetorical theory of fictionality, one of the central distinctions is between fiction as a global or generic framing and fictionality as a locally used rhetorical resource. This means that fictionality can appear across genres, including non-fictional genres. In non-fiction, fictionality would occur locally, as when a philosophical text uses a thought experiment or a speculative scenario. But in the novel, fictionality will become the global frame of the text, thus determining the perception of the work as fiction. But what does this perception as fiction do, say, to the modern facts of Robinson Crusoe? According to Richard Walsh, who is the founding figure of the recent rhetorical fictionality theory, in a fictional framing, our attention will be drawn to the relevance of things rather than their referential truthfulness. That is, in the global framing of Robinson Crusoe as fiction, the global framing will make any questions concerning the referential accuracy of the factual-looking content beside the point. Even though long passages of Crusoe's narration concern very concrete numbers and quantities, the modern facts they represent are not expected to match up to any reality. However, it means something to the very similitude of the work that the bookkeeping is done credibly and in accordance with the legitimate practices of the time. The method of knowledge production in operation in Robinson's stock-taking is plausible, even though the knowledge produced doesn't correspond to any real-world quantities and does not have relevance as that kind of knowledge. In the light of fictionality theory, we could say that the relevance of all the measuring and quantifying going on in Crusoe's narration actually lies in what it implies about the character of Crusoe and about the world he inhabits. Coming back to Puvi, it's possible to see some of the developments she describes in terms of fictionality theory, with its emphasis on relevance. According to Puvi, once the categories of fact and fiction are sufficiently differentiated, we are left with two kinds of standards for consistency in texts. Either the text should be consistent in referring to actual facts, and this is what is expected and was expected of non-fictional texts, or the text should be internally consistent, as fictional works were asked to do. By internal consistency, Puvi means that the early novel would typically give an explanation for its own fictionality, as we saw in Simona's presentation. For instance, in paratext by the author or a fictive persona such as an editor. This feature of the early novel has been discussed under the rubric of pseudo-factuality of the early novel, for instance by literary scholar Nicholas Page, among others. While the novel was becoming a firmly fictional genre that was at the same time capable of demonstrating within its fictional framework how the Enlightenment rationality produced facts, other narrative genres developed along parallel but separate paths. While non-fiction texts, from journalistic to historical and from economic to philosophical, certainly grappled with notions such as the modern fact, we also see how the narrative genres come to understand that such notions are not easily applied to narratives of histories, travels, or lives. Genres such as biography, history, and travel writing are non-fictional and they are often published side by side with the texts of natural philosophers or scientists, as we would call them. But they have to ground their factuality on something other than those maneuvers that produce modern facts. By way of an example, let us look briefly to one of the 3 volumes of Miscellanea Curiosa, a major undertaking of British Enlightenment science, which was commissioned by the Royal Society and overseen by the astronomer and physicist Edmund Halley, who later became the Astronomer Royal. The volumes were presented to the Society and survive in several printed editions. The 3rd volume of the 3 is titled Collection of Curious Travels, Voyages and Natural Histories of Countries. And it stands in an interesting contrast to, for example, the 1st volume, which contains, among other things, several astronomical, medical and biological treatises. The text we see here is called Historical Observations Relating to Constantinople by one Reverend Smith. For the purposes of this presentation, there is no need to read the text. We can see visually one interesting feature, namely that the author is using a footnote apparatus, and that the footnotes name secondary sources for the historical facts presented. This practice, of course, is still familiar to us. Indeed, in his book, The Footnote, A Curious History, historian Anthony Grafton credits Enlightenment philosophers and historiographers for popularizing the practice of using this kind of documentation as a token of credibility. What is striking here is that it's precisely those things that Arendt classifies as factual truths, in contrast to rational truths, which are accompanied by an appeal to the authority of a secondary source. As historical truths are contingent, they acquire authority, as Arendt posits, via testimony and witnessing, something that historians can find in the work of prior writers. The first 2 footnotes on the page on the left side refer, in fact, to older sources like the 9th century chronicles by the Byzantine Theophanes the Confessor, to mention just one. The footnotes do this to appeal to prior accounts known to many historians, and this is the necessary strategy with factual truths that are contingent and gain legitimacy via social circulation. My final example comes from the realm of biography and its questions of factual narrative methods. In what is likely the most famous 18th century biography written in English, James Boswell, the biographer of Samuel Johnson, starts by reflecting on the methods of writing someone's life. He writes, I quote, "Wherever narrative is necessary to explain, connect, and supply, I furnish it to the best of my abilities. But in the chronological series of Johnson's life, which I trace as distinctly as I can, year by year, I produce, whenever it is in my power, his own minutes, letters, or conversation." Boswell's method, then, involves using original documents, such as personal correspondence. Interestingly, he also cites Johnson, who was perhaps the most prominent English Enlightenment biographer, as an authority on biographical methods. When Boswell declares that he doesn't want to merely produce a dry narrative of facts, quote unquote, but that the true texture of a person's life is attained by paying attention to minute daily details instead of grand narrative arcs, he is often citing Johnson as a progenitor of these ideas. In Boswell's method, we see a combination of biographical narrative conventions and a more novel use of documents and direct citations. His own meta-narrative reflection on life-writing methods suggests that these devices aim to document the voice and opinions of their subject, but their function is also to contribute to a truer account of life. These are very preliminary ideas about these non-fictional genres that emerge during the 18th century, and I look forward to going deeper into these inquiries with Simona. But now to conclude, I would argue that looking closely how non-fictional narrative genres developed in the 18th century, and by paying attention to the kinds of devices they use to produce a texture of factuality, can lead us to understand how they have contributed to the kinds of factual rhetoric that is still recognizable to us. These texts reside on one side of the fact-fiction division that is becoming more and more entrenched towards the end of the 18th century. But the writers of biographies and histories clearly do not think that their texts will be perceived as factual just because they are not fictional. Instead, we can see a concerted effort in the non-fictional textual genres of the Enlightenment to produce factuality rhetorically. In my publications, I have tried to outline how a rhetoric of factuality in contemporary texts is constructed through references to institutionally approved sources, appeals to common knowledge and common sense, to experience and opinion presented as fact, and so forth. But clearly there is something more we can gain from understanding that notions of fictionality and factuality have historically salient relations to narrative genres that find their modern form and function during the 18th century. The post-truth discourses that we are justifiably worried about are often about twisting these Enlightenment categories and using them in a simplifying and totalizing way in ideological arguments. Talking about the historicity and the intertwined development of fact and fiction and textual genres is an antidote to these discourses because it resists the simplicity of polarization, of simply pitting things against each other. And at the same time, it gives out a signal that we are not simply taking fact and fiction for granted. Thank you.
Thank you, Samlu, for this highly interesting explanation of negotiation between fact and fiction through history, and that fictionality indeed is mirrored by factuality. We hurry along to the next speaker, Aina Nøding. She is a research librarian at the National Library of Norway. She was the leader of the Samkull project, Literary Citizens of the World, and she now heads the research project Map Made Abroad on Norwegian world literature. Nøding has published extensively on Danish and Norwegian book and media history, 1700 to 1900. And we can mention the books En pokkers skrivesyke, 1700-tallets dansk-norske tidsskrifter mellom sensur og ytringsfrihet, fra 2014. 18th Century Periodicals as Agents of Change, 2015. And of course her biography on Klaus Fasting. Klaus Fasting, dikter, journalist og opplysningspioner, from 2018. And she has now a brand new book from 2023, Literary Citizenship in Scandinavia in the long 18th century. Nøding was also part of the Holberg project in Bergen some years ago, and she is a key figure in Norwegian 18th century studies. And the title of her paper today is Reading Between the Lines in Periodical Media. Aina, it's always a pleasure to see you here in Bergen, so the floor is yours.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great honor to celebrate Simona today. Periodical fiction is often synonymous with a serial novel like this one by Dickens in a 19th century newspaper. It's typographically separated from news, opinions, and advertisements, and may be cut out and bound as a book. The original periodical installments of A Tale of Two Cities made its way across Europe to this leftist paper in Trondheim. Here the novel is printed with a new preface proclaiming the novel's revolutionary and historically correct content, and sits among news about the lack of political reform in England, murders, the international fame of Ibsen, and advertisements for coffee and sausages. The newspaper offers a political, topical, and historical context for reading that can set off interpretations not readily available in a bound volume. In other words, news and fiction were never separate spheres, but influenced each other in terms of how texts are written and interpreted, to the extent that the lines between fiction and news or advertisements become very blurred. And when we move further back to the 17th and 18th century, and this is even more striking in the sense that fiction or literature often is a news genre. So thus reading these papers requires the ability to juggle many genres, many voices simultaneously by constantly reading between the lines. So what we then discover is a literary culture where readers and writers are expert in navigating a society of censorship, of strict social and religious boundaries with the aid of fiction. So ever since the birth of news media, their untrustworthiness has been a recurring topic. The first newspaper in Danish, Den Danske Mercurius, from the 1660s, was written by the poet laureate Anders Bording in verse after the French fashion. While Bording attempted truthfulness in a literary form, the satirical journal, The Wrong Mercurius, published 60 years later, fully profited from the idea of news content as fake and scandalous. In other cases, such as the description of a sea monster in Copenhagen's Evening Post on the right here, trust is evoked by citing science and eyewitnesses while still dabbling in the incredible and monstrous. So the Evening Post was particularly popular because of its lifelike dramatizations of scenes and dialogues from the streets of Copenhagen. And the borders between news and fiction or literature were continuously employed and experimented with to reach a growing public readership, but also sort of to figure out what these news genres were and which genres best suited news media. So the periodical press did not sort of descend from heaven in a new ready-made form, but rather is a string of experiments in genres and reader contracts conducted by publishers, writers, readers, and government collectively, and over time. Some are successful, some are not. In an attempt to control and define the new media of newspapers and periodicals, the Dano-Norwegian king in 1701 made it illegal to mix news and opinions. News should be mere facts based on at least 2 printed foreign sources. And this paved the way for strict separation of genres and content between newspapers and periodicals. News and advertisements belonged in newspapers, published in Copenhagen only by royal privilege. Opinions and entertainment belonged in periodicals, which could be started by anyone at any time. And among them are periodicals that only carried prose fiction, for instance. Then, from around 1760, a third media form muddied the waters. Adresseavisene were local papers mainly focused on advertisements and were linked to an office for handling advertisements, so-called adressekontor. However, to fill the pages and to attract readers, they started carrying stories, essays, letters from readers, recipes, poems, and more. So it is within the latter 2 categories that we find most texts of fiction. The first issue of the Norway's third paper, which is an adresseavis, and was published in Trondheim from 1767, and it's a paper that still exists today. It carried a poem from the editor, followed by a short story called Avisdiskurs, a newspaper conversation. Both texts serve to defend this new invention and its appropriateness for facilitating a public conversation and information sharing. The story, which turns out is reprinted from German, was modeled on those found in the moral weeklies of Addison and Steele, The Tatler and The Spectator. So they are discussing news in public coffee houses, go hand in hand with formulating bourgeois morals and philosophy, which again then resulted in a politically engaged and reading public, according to the Holberg Prize laureate Jürgen Habermas. In a similar conversation written by the historian Zoom, which you mentioned, in his periodical Trondheimske Samlinger, there is this sense of a damn writing disease spreading epidemically among ordinary people. Everyone's a writer, in a range of more or less fictitious genre in public. And this was soon fueled further by the freedom of print from 1770, and they touched openly on topics of politics, such as the Struens affair, which prompted the start of the Evening Post, or the local economics in Bergen, discussed in Tobacco Discourses. These discussions and conversations are often staged as fictitious societies that act as mouthpieces in or frameworks for periodicals and newspapers. And these conversations can be set among the dead, among women, among children playing, men and women around private tea and coffee tables, or as friends meeting in the street or taking a stroll in the new invention, public parks. In Bergen, we find staged discussions about local economics in the periodical The Chatty Man from Bergen. And of course, everyone from Bergen knows there's this stereotype of people from Bergen being chatty. But this is by the local enfant terrible Bernt Børresen. The latter employed genres such as dialogues, poetry, and drama to criticize authorities and fight for the common good. And this text evokes the popular genre of a letter descending from heaven and involves such low lives as Kristen Upright and Ole Idiot, Ole Mehe, debating the stiff price on butter. And in a footnote, Børresen notes that a similar story in a previous issue had landed him in an ongoing legal battle. So the road from fiction to prison was short in Bergen. Women were a target audience for moral weeklies, and the perspectives often catered to was given a voice in separate publications. However, they were often written by a man. So even when presenting advice on raising children or dyeing textile, as seen here, the framework is a fictitious society of women, including, for instance, a barber's widow and a housekeeper. And, oh, where am I? Here we are. Yes, and this is a washing machine, in case you wanted. So soon periodicals and papers for children followed, molding them to become consumers of and contributors to the new media. However, the periodical genres may look a bit different. Under the heading News in the Newspaper for Children, seen on the right, we find a conversation between father and son on temperance. Stuffing the memory rather than develop reasoning is no longer the preferred method, we learn from the introductory motto. Even the papers catered to children, as seen here in Trondheim's Adresseavis, with a story from Madame Beaumont's famous Magasin des Enfants. In this case, the story also acts as an advertisement for the editor's business of renting out books. So if you like this story in the paper, you can rent the book for 6 shillings at my office. Likewise, you could buy the play by Goldoni from the book printer in Christiania, or read parts of it in the newspaper, both published by the same printer. So there are several instances of poems and stories morphing into advertisements for new books, while also serving as a proper news item, including poems in honor of a person or a specific event. And furthermore, fables were a well-known genre of satire and personal attacks, and are employed as such in the press. One reader writes to the newspaper in Bergen complaining about the prolific use of metaphorical foxes in its columns, of which you see an example here. The same victim of the fable about the cat in the forest, which was the church assistant Mogens Mikael Børsen, was later subject to a named reprimand in the paper in connection with a legal battle he had with a priest. And that reprimand is then followed by 2 fables. By Phaedrus, one about a monkey and one about a self-aggrandizing fly. So in some instances, readers perhaps read too much into these fables in the newspaper and sort of resulted in angry letters to the editor. But what we see is that the newspapers create a semiotic room for interpreting old fables or anecdotes about internationally famous people in a contemporary and local contexts. And that is also fueled by the fact that texts are really rarely supplied with the author's name. And of course, one reason for this practice of hiding behind a story or establishing this kind of uncertainty of reference was censorship laws and libel laws. Annabel Patterson noted of British literature that literature is a method of circumventing censorship in the 18th century. And that is certainly true in Denmark, Norway too. In a society where the threat of pre- or post-print censorship loomed, authors and editors were well versed in the art of self-censorship, including hiding behind what the translator and editor Lodda even put on his title page, the thoughts of others, and that is foreigners. Why risk your life, your honor, your happiness, he says, by disclosing your own thoughts when you can print someone else's, or even better, in the form of fiction? So that's what he does. He prints translations. And of course, a master at this game was the author, literary critic, and editor Klaus Fasting from Bergen. And in his periodical from the late 1770s, Provincialbladet, he describes the European practice of reprinting stories from other publications and rewriting them to the point that nobody knows what the original looked like. And it no longer belongs to the one who initially wrote it, he says. And he also employs this strategy of rewriting and translation for several purposes. One of them is political. When he reprints this story, for instance, among others, that questions and opposes slavery, Fasting spices up the text with blood and tears and feeling to try to influence the reader's reaction to this horrific Dano-Norwegian reality of owning and profiting off slaves in the West Indies. So his abolitionist views and consequent arguments are quite early in Denmark, Norway too. In a private letter to his friend P.A. Heiberg in Denmark, he complains of the reality of self-censorship in the Age of Enlightenment, which only allowed for the metaphorical light of an oil lamp, not the sun. So this is his way of sort of circumventing that condition. So what I've been trying to give you some brief examples of from a very large material is that fiction filled a number of functions in papers and periodicals. They catered to an increasingly diverse and expanding readership, which demanded a range of genres, including fiction, fables, stories, novels, dreams, drama, moral tales, poetry, all considered perfect genres of the periodical press. The reasons for that were aesthetic pleasure, entertainment, and instruction, as per usual, but also their handiness in dressing and masking topical issues that could not be addressed too directly for personal or political reasons. So, of course, we find most of these functions in text published in books as well. So what I would argue is different here is that this media context adds a constantly present set of question marks as to who speaks, why, with what degree of fictitiousness. A story that in a book could easily be merely read as a fable, once placed next to an advertisement, a letter to or from the editor, or a local piece of news, takes on this possibility of added meaning. Fiction in the press is rarely just fictitious. Moreover, never boring your reader is paramount for periodicals, and that means, of course, ensuring novelty and diversity, constantly taking on new forms like a chameleon in a way that books never can. And in negotiating fact and fiction, the 18th century periodical press intrigued, educated, and entertained its readers, and hopefully it still can. Thank you.
Thank you, Aina, for this look into the role of fact and fiction in periodicals, newspapers, the genres so emblematic of modernity itself. Now, for our last speaker, but not least, Ulrik Langen is professor of 18th century history at the Saxo Institute, University of Copenhagen. He has published a series of books on the 18th century culture, such as Den avmektige, en biografi om Kristian VII, 2008, Struense, 2018, and recently, the world's first full press freedom, the radical experiment of Denmark-Norway in 1770-73, on the Greuter in 2022 with Fredrik Stjernfeldt also. Among Langen's research fields are urban and cultural history and social history of print and communication. He has received several literary prizes for his original and accessible historical authorship. The title for this paper today is Facts, Fiction, Anonymity, and Pseudonymity. Ulrik, it is a pleasure to finally welcome you to Bergen, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this generous introduction. Simone, congratulations. Thank you for inviting me here. I'll start out by throwing out some dates. You're not supposed to remember them. I'll return to them during my talk here. But on the September the 14th of 1770, the Press Freedom Ordinance of Denmark-Norway was released. This was sensational. Since late summer that year, the royal physician Johann Friedrich Struensee had gained near absolute power in the dual kingdom of Denmark-Norway through his influence on the mentally ill King Christian VII. Now, during this 16-month Struensee reign, which ended in January 1772, after a coup against Struensee, a string of reforms was launched, of which one of the most radical was the introduction of unlimited freedom of the press. This created a media revolution that lasted until November 1773, when the experiment ended with a string of limitations to the existing ordinance. But contemporaries knew that a new unique situation was now coming to an end, and the past 3 years were dubbed trykkefrihedstiden, the press freedom period. This period of unlimited press freedom was exceptional, and the volume of the literary market exploded. An avalanche of pamphlets on every topic imaginable poured out from the printing houses, most of them written by anonymous writers. And these many publications show a surprising variety from serious political, economic, philosophical treatises over criticism, polemics, ridicule, entertainment, spin campaigns, obscenities, libel, and even threats. You can see here. Just to show you here, in this woodcut from 1766, you can see printers and bookbinders at work just to illustrate this kind of production. Now, the elaborate sentences in the Press Freedom Ordinance aimed to explain the king's decision to introduce press freedom. And looking at the choice of words in the specific sentences, the ordinance reflects an outline of an Enlightenment program characteristic of the period. The ordinance was based on the notion of an orderly public sphere in which truth could be located through impartial inquiry. The impartial search for truth, as it was stated in the ordinance. On this slide, you'll see some keywords from the ordinance. This inquiry was to be carried out by upright patriots who acted according to their insight, conscience, and conviction. Now, the purpose was to use Enlightenment guidelines to eliminate obsolete errors by attacking abuses and uncovering prejudice. Thus, there was an implicit assumption in the ordinance about who would constitute the actors of the new public sphere, upright patriots, and what the function of the public ought to be, namely the search for truth. But it was unclear how the actors in practice ought to communicate in this new public sphere. In what way was the search for truth to be carried out? Now, the very first publications after the introduction of press freedom were pseudonymous and anonymous, and they were fictional. The student Martin Brun was the first to exploit the new liberty more systematically with a series of sharp moralist and fictional portrayals of pretentious Copenhageners in a short-lived periodical whose first issue appeared in the end of October. Shortly after, press freedom exploded when the Norwegian author Jacob Christian Bie, under the pseudonym of Philopatreias, which means lover of the fatherland, launched a pamphlet in early December attacking vicars, lawyers, and grain dealers. And the response to this pamphlet was immense and intense and quickly grew into a sort of a maze of debates involving more than 80 pamphlets and lots of articles and comments in papers and magazines. Most participants remained anonymous and pseudonymous. It was not implied by the Press Freedom Ordinance, but in practice, the large majority of press freedom writings proved to be anonymous and pseudonymous. And at the time, this was not very unusual. Articles and comments in newspapers and periodicals, like the ones that I've been talking about here, had as a rule been quite anonymous before press freedom. But such contributions before press freedom had not only been subject to state censorship, but also passed through the hands of a responsible editor. Neither was any longer the case for most of the press freedom writings. And this implied that anonymity now radically changed status. Now it could be used as a cover giving space to personal attacks, libel, and threats, just as it made it possible to express viewpoints for which the author did not assume any personal responsibility, and which might often differ entirely from his or her own personal views. This gave rise to discussions about the dangers of anonymity and pseudonymity. It was widely felt that if the public were to be guided by truthfulness, as we saw in the ordinance, limits had to be set on the fictional potential of anonymity and pseudonymity. For some debaters, it was also a question of sort of controlling what they felt was the poor quality of the writings that press freedom had caused by letting too many unexperienced and untamed writers into the new public sphere, because they really they were suffering from this writing disease that Aina was talking about. But the flood of fiction could not be stopped. Fictional letters fictional anecdotes, fictional characters, fictional places and spaces, fictitious conversations, and fictitious epistolary correspondences were vital parts of the press freedom pamphlets written by fictitious characters. In addition, fables and fictitious travel narratives in the style of Ludvig Holberg and Nils Klim became common. So these castaway novels that Simona was talking about actually was printed here in a sort of a more popular and shorter versions on cheap paper and not costing a lot. One press freedom writer stood out, and he'll be my example here today, stood out as a master of pseudonymity and literary role-playing in this new, diverse public sphere. The before-mentioned Martin Brun was one of the period's most prolific and creative authors, and he experimented widely with genres and styles, primarily through pseudonymous and fictional author personas. To him, a division between fact and fiction did not make sense. Brun was a 29-year-old student when press freedom was introduced, and during the press freedom period, he published at least 60 pamphlets, which is a number that can be ascribed to him. Maybe the number is higher, we don't know that. His early writings were often political role pamphlets, using fictional mouthpieces like Ole Smedesvend, Ole the Smith, and Jeppe Vægter, Jeppe the Watchman. Later, in the spring of 1771, he even chose the devil as the narrator in a pamphlet. He also opened his pamphlets to concerts of different voices, where the concerns of various social groups are heard. And in particular, Brun stresses the importance of giving the lower estates a voice. It may occur allegorically as in a pamphlet about the conversations between a coffee pot, a teapot, and a chamber pot. And here you see the cover of a pamphlet. And maybe you remember you've seen this illustration before in one of Einer's slides, because it was also an illustration used at the periodical called Tebordet. It's the same, although there is, you can see this in this I've been magnifying this enlargement, there is an addition, and that is the chamber pot there, placed behind the gentleman's chair. In the dialogue, and we haven't planned this, I mean, Einar and I, this is a pure coincidence, really it is. So, and in the dialogue between the three pots, criticism is voiced against the coffee pot, representing affected upper-class behavior in fine parlors and distinguished houses. And Brun's sympathy is evidently with the simple, overlooked, but yet indispensable chamber pot. In contrast, the coffee pot is a snob, praising itself for passing around among the delicate hands of socialites and facilitating their possibility to express themselves. And this refers to a common 18th century idea that people became more talkative when drinking coffee, as well as coffee drinking as a social phenomenon. Now, tea was a less socially distinguished drink and represents a sort of a simpler level of social stratification. The teapot tends, during the text, to side more and more with the chamber pot, which claims that it is no less touched by the hands of the fairest ladies than the arrogant coffee pot, which is really nothing but a simple servant. The equal status of pots, that is, social groups, across social stratification is Brun's implied conclusion. Now, having pots making conversation is as fictional as it gets, but the social comment was embedded in a factual world. But Struensee also knew that facts could be viewed differently in the steadily growing readership of the period, which is evident in his most productive period immediately after the coup against Count Struensee in January 1772. Until his execution in the end of April 1772, Struensee was incarcerated in the Citadel in Copenhagen. And numerous pamphlets celebrated the coup, and even if most of these pamphlets about Struensee pouring out from about January to March 1772, they were vilifying the fallen count, but Martin Brun discreetly demonstrated that this was not the only possible approach. He brought to this booming market of popular Struensee literature no less than 7 wildly differing portrayals of the enigmatic prisoner. Few of his contemporaries, however, would know that Brun was the source of this variety of anonymous Struensee portraits. In 1771, Brun has excelled, as we heard just before, in role portraits, speaking as Ole the Smith and Jeppe the Watchman, and many more. Now he time and again picked Struensee as a narrator. The field was open. The fallen count was imprisoned with no access for writers or journalists, so elaborating on his thoughts, his feelings, emotions, and reflections was sort of a free lunch. And very briefly, the 7 Struensee personas can be summed up as Struensee as an instrument of the devil, Struensee as a cunning and selfish conspirator, Struensee as a shameful prisoner admitting to his guilt, even pleading the king for a quick execution. 4. Struensee as a stoic and fatalist freethinker, accepting that life goes up and down. 5. Struensee as a judge of human nature. 6. Struensee as a cool political analyst, asking for a nuanced judgment of his results. And then there is the last of the 7 Struensee versions. Struensee as an avenger against printers and anonymous and synonymous writers. Now, the outpouring of Struensee pamphlets in the weeks after the coup had been so spectacular that Brun made it the subject of one of his pamphlets in which Struensee attacks the host of printers and authors involved. And in the face of all that is written and published about him, Struensee in this pamphlet complains that he is now ascribed sins and crimes entirely invented. Fictional sins, fictional crimes. He argues that there is nothing skillful in slandering a person and accusing him of made-up crimes. They shame me for profit only, as Brun's Struensee critically sums up. He criticizes the writers for writing under invented names while at the same time ridiculing named individuals like Struensee himself. Brun here is on the brink of deliberate self-parody or even self-criticism. Not only had he himself excelled in fictive roles and narrators the year before, but he had already, in the few weeks since the coup, been the most productive pamphleteer and not at all spared the market for invented Struensee characters. In this pamphlet, Struensee appears as a rather pleasant, a low-key person with insights into human nature, ambition, weaknesses, and so on. But it's a quite complex sort of textual situation here. Brun posing as Struensee, complaining about writers like Brun himself and how they describe and fictionalize the deeds of Struensee. It is quite an impressive series of Struensee characters that Brun was able to produce in a matter of few weeks through January and February. Nobody had the idea of what went on in the mind of the famous prisoner in the Citadel, and Brun sort of exploited this open space better than anyone. His wild imagination reached a pinnacle in these variations. Simultaneously, he responded to the demand of a growing market, and Bruun's variety of Struensee versions indicates that he knew that Copenhageners were not alike. His different Struensee versions would cater to various groups of consumers on the new pamphlet market of press freedom. Martin Bruun is not representative of the press freedom writers in the sense that he wrote much more than any other author of the period. Furthermore, he was highly inventive, productive, and versatile beyond any given standards. But he exemplifies how anonymity and pseudonymity paved the way for unprecedented textual creativity. The search for truth could be carried out in ways unimaginable in September 1770, when press freedom was introduced. And any clear distinction between truth and fiction was sort of dissolved in the popular demand for press freedom writings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ulrik, for the example of Martin Bruun. I think this is a new acquaintance for most of us. And now thank you to all the speakers for interesting introductions and for keeping your 20 minutes time. There is now 30 minutes left of this seminar, and we will start with the conversation amongst the panel, and then there will be some room for questions and answers. And just to get it going, I would ask you, now you have approached the 18th century, the fact-fiction dichotomy. If it is, I'm not sure it's a dichotomy, but you have these concepts of fact and fiction through different examples, different genres, different perspectives from the 18th century. But what would you say is the core sort of... We often use the concept of Enlightenment on the 18th century, and sort of what is the Enlightenment spirit? What is it about the 18th century that brings these concepts so much in the forefront? It is sort of, Simona, you were mentioning the rise of science, of course, as sort of a basic phenomenon behind this discussion. Is that sort of the explanation? Is sort of like a natural way the rise of science comes, and then we have to clarify these concepts, or?
Yes, thank you so much for that question, Janne. It's a big question. What is the Enlightenment? And but yeah, to me, when reading all of the Danish novels from the 18th century, I was really surprised to find that a lot of them do discuss science, and I do think that what can be called the scientific revolution leading up towards the 18th century plays a key role in making this distinction between fictional and factual genres. So, of course, I think we've always been able to communicate about non-existent states of affairs and use our imagination to tell each other stories. But it is only in the 18th century that we see these distinctions between different fictional and factual genres. And I do think that an empirically based notion of truth or factuality is kind of the precondition for genres of fact and fiction. And then the panelists here have demonstrated that throughout the 18th century we see various attempts at both kind of mixing fact and fictionality, but also differentiating between the two. And I think the scientific revolution and the idea of fact as being connected to science, and that we can actually measure the real world, is the precondition for the differentiation between fact and fiction. And when reading the 18th century novels, I was really curious to see how they engage in scientific debates like Holberg does in Nils Klim, and it wasn't something I expected to find, really. So I think it definitely is connected to the rise of science. Yeah, that would be my answer.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Well, you're looking at me.
We can take
No,
it.
but I think there is also sort of a political side of it, because this idea of that if 18th century reformers were to reform society, they had to do it on the ground of truthfulness and on the grounds of being in agreement. This is a very, very specific thing to the political discourse in 18th century. That is, that we need to be in agreement of what we do. Disagreement is bad, because disagreement implies that we haven't found the truth, because everyone can agree on the truth. So this is very much something, and it also said in press freedom ordinance, impartial search for truth. So being in a party is in itself something bad, because then it means that there are some other people in another party that you will not agree with. That was also what you saw in the French Revolution, that this idea that being a virtuous citizen also had to, that you have to be sort of totally in agreement with the new society, with being the new man. So this is also so I think the fiction and the idea of fiction and facts comes in here, because if things are too fictional, we cannot agree, because it sort of opens the room for different interpretations and so on. But also there was this a bit earlier in the 18th century, there was this idea that especially among elite observers, that popular reading had this problem. There was this problem sort of embedded in popular reading, that people of lower classes believe everything in print, as opposed to what they hear, because, 18th century was still Anwesenheitsgesellschaft, a presence society, face-to-face culture. People heard rumors, spoke to each other. This was also a way of communicating and getting information. But printed information had this sort of quality of being more truthful, or at least that was what elite persons thought about common people reading text. So I think that this is very much an implication in the whole Enlightenment, mainstream Enlightenment discourse, this problem.
Yes, you're looking at me. Well, yes, and I think you're right about, of course, the political aspect and agreement and patriotism and all of that. But at the same time, this is also the age for advocating tolerance, for advocating different worldviews existing sort of side by side. And how do you do that? You do that by sort of coming together, discussing, learning about different points of view. And one way of doing that is through fiction, and sort of learning about how the world looks from a different perspective, or from in a different part of the world. And I think sort of as both as a way of negotiating and discussing what is the truth, fiction is important, and of course also a way of communicating, of education, and sort of both spreading these ideas of tolerance, of different rights for different groups of people. Fiction is very important, of course, in the form of moral tales and in conduct novels, but also, as I tried to show in the newspapers too, in not perhaps having a very distinct difference between fact and fiction, but sort of trying to use fiction as a way of discussing what is the truth. Yeah.
Samuel?
Yes. As you may have noticed, I'm not an 18th century scholar, and I'm sort of coming to this whole thing from a contemporary angle. But one thing that I run into constantly is that when we talk about fact and fiction and truths and falsehoods, they sort of lead back to this era. And whether we call it Enlightenment or not, it's the 18th century. But I do think that the things that people have mentioned here, politics and science, are major parts in this, because we actually see all kinds of troubles coming from this undifferentiation between different genres. There were also economical crises when the credit economy was sort of came to force in England, and credit was a new way of understanding money that was basically fictional, and there were stock markets and things like that, and then people lost money, and it was a problem, and there was moral outrage sometimes against this undifferentiation between different genres of money, different genres of writing, as in periodicals, and where myriad of different text types would exist in the same place, and people wouldn't necessarily know how what kind of attitude to take towards them. And there were some moral questions about Robinson Crusoe as well. People wanted to know whether it's true or not. And I think this atmosphere, this climate has to do with the Enlightenment and the need to have categories in order to have these new nice things in the society.
Yes, because I'm sure many people in the audience, they think, well, surely also in antiquity they have the difference between truth, what is true, what is not true, what is fact, what is fiction in a way. But what you are highlighting is the very specific genres and forms that these concepts are taking in the 18th century, which is sort of start of modernity. One thing I was thinking about is you take your examples, very many interesting examples, mostly Danish examples, and how representative is this? And one of the reasons that I posed this question is that I know that in Simona's work there is a difference. There's sort of a critique of the European canon from the perspective of the particular Danish canon. So there's a cultural development in Denmark, and you have the 1770s Struense intermezzo, and so on, and you have periodicals. So I'm wondering, to what degree is this what you are describing a Danish or a Dano-Norwegian discussion, and to what degree would you say it is just part of the European Enlightenment?
Yeah, so what I tried to do was to actually read all of the novels published in Danish in the 18th century, and that makes it a lot easier to say that it is very representative, because you have all of the material there. And I guess in one sense you're right in saying that I guess challenge the canon of literature, because I try to say that there are very important Scandinavian novels written in the 18th century that have been completely forgotten. So that's kind of my take on the question of canon and how representative the material is. But I was so happy to hear you talk about periodicals and pamphlets, because that's types of material that I haven't touched upon myself. And one point of similarity that I see in all of the different genres we have studied is really that they all seem to fight for an idea of the importance of the Enlightenment, right? So I do think they have, all of the genres have this in common, and that can be, it seems to me, generalized. The fact that the conduct novels try to teach young women, especially women, how to behave. It's kind of part of the Enlightenment project as well. The historical novel tried to teach its reader about history. The shipwreck novel or the travel novel tried to teach the reader about other countries and imperialism and so on. And the pamphlets and the periodicals, they try to teach the readers something as well. And I think that's kind of the core of the Enlightenment project, that being in fictional forms or in factual forms, they all had this aim of kind of being part of an Enlightenment project. I mean, some of them were published just for the fun of it, but many of them, I think, really had this idea, this vision of an Enlightenment project. And to me, it seems that that is a point that might be generalized.
I know.
Yes, and I think you're absolutely right. And I think you could say that the genres and the sort of the text culture is very much European in the way they adapt. The genres, they adapt the way they do it, and of course, in the enormous amount of translation and adaptation of translated texts that are sort of, they literally take the foreign texts and sort of adapt them to a Danish, Norwegian context, and then of course write copies and whatnot. But there is also, you could say that there is the political context for doing that in Denmark, Norway is very different from, let's say, Britain or even France, which was also an absolutist monarchy. In that, in the sense that you often talk about a Nordic Enlightenment, where which also includes northern parts of Germany, in terms of the sense of community and the patriotism that sort of is a common goal to what you do, that you talked about, in a sense that Enlightenment sort of go hand in hand with the government and the church in a way that it doesn't necessarily do in other countries, I think. So yes, there's two sides to that story, I think.
Yeah, but I also think that if you, for example, look at that's what Ejner's been investigating, looking at all these periodicals, especially the Spectator kind of, well, they just copy what you see mostly in England, but also in Germany and France. Even Adresseaviser is, I think it was a French invention and so on. So a lot of this material is just sort of a part of a general European trend. On the other hand, what is interesting is also that this very local thing, for example, the pamphlets, and in that intermezzo, as you call it, which is a very good term to use in that sense, they engage very much in everyday topics, so it becomes very local. But then again, you see a lot of references to, for example, Jeppe the Watchman. He's talking about, for example, referring to the philosopher Spinoza, which is very much Enlightenment, radical Enlightenment. But he calls him Mr. Spinach instead. But everyone knows that is Spinoza he's talking about. La Métrie, also he refers to La Métrie, also that famous French Enlightenment thinker, and he's just called Herr Mette in his in his discourse on the state. This Jeppe the Vector's discourse on the state. So you have this very intriguing mix of very local, everyday deliberations, and then references to sort of mainstream Enlightenment culture.
I think before we let the audience pose some questions, I think we could have a short round on the question, what are we really doing when we are historicizing about the fact-fiction division or concept? Are we sort of moving into sort of relativism where we are blurring the difference, and it all sort of develops into a question of genres, history, and so on, or is the agenda more to try to distinguish or to underline and to try to find out what is actually fiction, what is fact? So the necessity of this distinction, fact or fiction, or are we sort of, is it a relativistic project?
Yeah. So if I may begin. Yeah. So my project is definitely trying to make distinctions between what we see as fictional and factual. But that being said, I really appreciate the many ways in which the authors of the 18th century made use of fictionality, as I would call it, within genres that we today perceive of as being factual. So my take on this question is to say that fictionality might exist within various genres, and we can identify ways and techniques of fictionality, which I think you did an excellent job on proving. And then we might also distinguish between fictional and factual genres being something else than the rhetorical device by which we signal to our readers or audiences that we use invention. But I really like your distinction, and several of your distinctions, Emily, especially the one between factual and more kind of mathematical truth. And I think it's important to keep this in our minds as well, so we're not just distinguishing between fictionality and then fact and fiction, but also different ideas of what really makes factuality, what makes that up, and the ways that we perceive of factuality. And your example with the footnotes and how that has developed as a kind of signpost of factuality, I think is really valuable. So to me, it's definitely not a relativistic project. It's quite the opposite. But I do think it's possible to talk about various techniques by which we want to signal that we are now entering a discourse of fictionality or factuality.
Just to sort of say some of the same things in another way. What is very interesting here is that as you showed, that some of these novels actually have disclaimers saying, "Now listen, people, this is fiction," and you can also see that, for example, in very sort of literature for common people in 17th and 18th century, broadsheet ballads. All the titles is always, this is the true story about something. It is that truthfulness is always a part of the title, just to indicate, to disclaim that this is the truth. Now, if you look at modern day social media and so on, the only disclaimers you see is that are commercial. This is an advertisement or something like that. So that is quite we're sort of moving into another world of different factualities and different fictionalities, and these disclaiming factors are quite, let's say, quite blurry.
Yeah, so
yeah. Well, of course, from this post-truth point of view, it might be a worry that there are plural facts, plural fictionalities, and we see a lot of genres where these two are like blending. But I agree that it is not a relativistic project, it's the opposite, because whenever we look back to the past, for example, this Enlightenment era, we see that people actually do know the distinction of fact and fiction, and there are several reasons why they don't always know it, and we see that it causes problems and raises questions and creates changes in how people think about writing and even society and its other aspects.
Thank you.
Yes,
Yes,
I can just add that I think what drew me to the 18th century text culture and what I love about it is, of course, its playfulness, and the fact that, in fact, there's always sort of a motivation behind the text. They want to do something out there in the world. It's not in a sort of a separate aesthetic sphere. It's always a sort of a pragmatic relationship between text and society, text and the world, even when it comes to novels or poems or whatnot. And they do that in a way that sort of really engages you as a reader. You have to be on your toes because you need to, and it's not really about that's the person saying that and that's the original intention or something like that. I think it's about sort of just diving into that playfulness and the multiplicity of meanings that are opened when you engaging in a culture that really just loves that sort of multiple levels going on, and and not sort of the essentialist approach to it, while they also sort of grapple with how to deal with that in scientific or political context. But just go along and enjoy it.
Thank you. Well, we have some minutes left for questions and answers. We have 2 microphones. Please raise your hand and state your name and be brief.
Thank you. My name is Frode Helmik Pedersen, professor of Nordic literature here in Bergen. Thank you for the thought-provoking talks and discussion. I want to follow up on the question of the historical thesis here, because, and I think maybe there's a confusion that has to do with languages, because in Norwegian and Danish we don't really use fiction as a genre term. So it's above the genres in a way. So I wonder if that sort of plays into this, but I'm kind of confused as to how strong do you mean that thesis, that fiction was emerging in the 18th century? If we look back at Spenser's The Faerie Queene, or if we look to Shakespeare, or if we look to Cervantes, which is a play on fiction and fact, and to antiquity and Aristotle, who says that the difference between poetry and the difference between history writing is that the one is, you know, the whole thesis there. So that presupposes that we've always known the difference between fact and fiction. And how does that connect with your thesis that fiction is emerging in the 18th century?
Yeah.
I think this was put.
Yeah, I think thanks so much. I think I could give a more lengthy answer later, maybe, but just to put it briefly, I think you're quite right that there's a difference between the way we talk about fiction in an English context and then in a Danish or Norwegian context. But when I say fiction, I mean it as a kind of an umbrella term for various genres. So it's not only the novel, but also the short story, the movie, the what have we, computer games and so on. So it's kind of an umbrella term for various genres of fiction, you could say. And then when it comes to the other question, I do mean it strongly, because, I've studied the question of fiction historically in many different ways. One way was to look in dictionaries where we only find our idea of fiction in the modern context, where it equates genres in the 18th century. So if we equate fiction with an umbrella term for fictional genres, we only see that in the dictionaries in the 18th century. Another part of my study was this study of the prefaces, the introductory text to the novels, where it seems as if the novelists are really struggling with explaining to the reader what fiction is, and they seem to want to tell the reader what we mean by fiction. Fiction is definitely something that's not taken for granted in this context. And then, as a third point, I could mention the ways in which techniques of fictionality arise within the novels. So what I've tried to do in my studies is to investigate how in the beginning of the 18th century we don't see techniques of fictionality like omniscience, for example, but that's something that arises with the novel as a genre and not with other genres. So my view on this question is simply to say that Shakespeare definitely knew how to use his imagination and to use fictionality, but at his time we didn't have a genre that was seen as a fictional genre, so it wasn't possible to enter libraries or bookshops where we could go to a shelf that said, here are the fictional genres and here are the factual genres, and the same goes for antiquity. So kind of briefly put, I mean it strongly, and I base it on these and other investigations. But I would love to talk more about this after this discussion.
Thank you, Simona, for a thorough within these limits that we have. And now it's 14:59, and I know that Björn, the academic director, he has some words. So I think we have to finish the discussion. Thank you to the audience. Thank you for your questions. Thank you to all the participants, and of course, thank you to Simona, and congratulations
Thank
again.
you so much.
Thanks a lot. I think Jørgen has summed up some of what I wanted to say. I wanted to thank you also, Jørgen, for having deftly and expertly moderated this discussion. Thank you to all the panelists. You've done a wonderful job. We should have had much more time to discuss this. There will be ample opportunity to do that later on, also, I hope. Tonight, there will be a Holberg Prize event at the House of Literature at 7, to which you're all invited if you haven't signed up already. Pardon? 6. I'm an anthropologist. I get confused with time. So 6 o'clock, please don't listen to me. Listen to my wonderful colleague, Ellen. 6 o'clock for that. Last but not least, I want to thank the audience, again, those that have come here to the University Aula for engaging and listening and questioning our panelists. Today's program is over here in the Aula, but 6 o'clock at the House of Literature tonight for the Holberg Prize event. Please join us again tomorrow for 2 major events here. First, we have the masterclass at 10 o'clock sharp, with Holberg Prize laureate Joan Martinez Allier and 4 PhD students from the Nordic countries. And at 2 o'clock sharp, Joan Martinez Allier will give his Holberg lecture in this room. Both events will also be streamed, so welcome back then in the flesh or on the screen. Thank you.